Welcome to another podcast recording. The background to these, as I mentioned the last one with Bruce Damer, was that I've realised we have a bunch of listeners who are still listening to the old Biota podcasts, and I thought it was important to do an update with regards to the folks, so I'd like to welcome on Jeffrey Ventrella. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello, Tom. Good to talk to you again.
So before we start on the A-Life-related topics, one of the things that I enjoy about knowing you on Facebook is that you send regular fractals, and you seem to be doing a variety of different things with fractals currently as well as the A-Life-related stuff. Is there any thought about linking the two of them and getting A-Life-generated fractals out there?
Well, that could mean a number of things, obviously. I suppose that some of my A-Life-related work creates things that have fractal-like qualities.
Certainly.
Well, but the things that I've been putting up are pretty much all coming from a particular software piece that I wrote that makes fractal curves. And I created that when I was working on a project to submit a paper to the Bridges Math and Art Conference on fractal curves that fit within a five-fold symmetry pattern, which would not correspond to any tilings that are periodic. It would only correspond to aperiodic tilings, such as Penrose tiling and so on. And also this really cool new tiling that just came out that everybody's hearing about. So that was the origin of that fractal curve program. And, you know, I kind of do it as therapy every night. I'll make another one. Sometimes I'll even make two, and it's just fun. And it becomes more and more mindless all the time because I've gotten so used to doing it. And I think that when things become more mindless, other things start to come through. So I'm making them and keep posting them. It's kind of fun.
It is. It very definitely is. When we last talked, you were working on augmented reality. What was the evolution of that up until now? Are you still touching on that occasionally, or is it not something you play with?
Well, I haven't worked on it since last time we talked. I'm no longer making iOS apps, and I'm more interested now in developing for the browser. And at some point, I may take some of my JavaScript code and get it into a mobile form. But yeah, that's what I've been doing. I am going to start a virtual reality project soon for scientific application, and I'm getting an HTC Vive Pro in the mail maybe a month from now. So that's an interesting project. Yeah, and I've got a bunch of A-Life related things. One that I may have mentioned to you before is that I submitted a paper to the A-Life conference.
Certainly. I was just reading it.
Did you get it?
Yes. Yes, you did. You did. In fact, I had a number of questions from it, but introduce it to the audience.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's see. I kind of have a bit of a history with vestibular, the science of vestibular sense. Particularly when I ended up with vertigo once on a trip in Japan, which everything spun for a while, and then I learned about the vestibular sense and how important it is, and I started writing about it and thinking about it, and that kind of became the inspiration for this little A-Life thing, which is basically spring and point mass physics structures that can walk. And they stay upright, and the reason they can stay upright is that they are continually adjusting their motions according to how much they're tilting. So that was the basis of it, and I'm still waiting to hear whether they've accepted the paper. But I will be making a video about it at some point.
I didn't realize that your work in this went back to 94. So that was the main thing I took away from the paper, was I guess I had a sense of some of your other stuff, like gene pool and things like that, associated with movement. And I think you had done some walkers with Peck maybe as well. So I had a sense that you had some previous playing in the field, but I didn't realize it went back till 1994. So that was a...
Yes, it goes all the way back to when I was at the MIT Media Lab. I was actually, this is part of my my dissertation was using genetic algorithms for various things that are design related and animation related, and so I created these stick figures that could walk. But my physics chops were pretty simple back then, as well as many other things. So it was. I did get a paper in the A-Life conference, and this was actually the same conference, A-Life 6, I think it was, that Carl Sims showed.
Certainly, yep, it was.
So
yes.
Yeah, so I was obviously way in the shadow of that because that was so spectacular. But yeah, I started back then, and even a little before that, when I was at UCSD, I was exploring some of the things that became swimbots. And this is, I decided that, gosh, now why not try this thing, which has been on my mind, ever since, reducing it down to simpler mechanics of just springs and point masses, and the computational power is so much better now than it used to be that I can kind of do it on my Mac M1 here. Yeah.
The nature of self-writing is something. I have twin daughters now who are 2, and watching them learn to walk and they both learned to walk completely differently. But the nature of self-writing is very much, I think, part of the early childhood learning to walk experience as well. So that certainly rang true with me as I read your paper.
Oh, say that again?
That rang true with me, the notion of self-writing as being critical to actually the process of walking.
Right, yes. And what's also amazing to me, especially from reading other papers and getting a little more background, is that the vestibular sense is so tightly fused with visual proprioception and things like that. I just saw a video of a baby elephant learning to walk for the first time, and it was very cute, and reminding me of how effortful this is at the beginning, and then how effortless it is, for us as healthy adults walking around life.
Yes. But very much vestibular, so it's an interesting, it's an interesting way to describe the problem. I think probably will provide, as you're already showing, some novel solutions. So yes,
What's that? Oh, novel.
Yes, it provides novel solutions.
Yeah. So hopefully they'll think so at the A-Life conference, and I'll get my paper published.
It is interesting, the history. I mean, you create a good survey in your paper on the history of these algorithms and how they seem to be a kind of perennial classic at the A-Life conferences. I remember when I was probably at A-Life 12, they had a bunch of walkers and swimmers as well. It seems to be a good part of the the general A-Life repertoire.
Yes, it is, and I was curious whether the A-Life reviewers are getting tired of that genre, but hopefully not. I think it has so much more that we can continue to explore.
So the other thing that you emailed me about was associated with your experimentation on clusters, which I'm assuming is spheres. Can you talk a little bit more about clusters and what you found with them?
Oh yes, clusters. Yeah, that's a theme that continues to evolve. In fact, I just finished making a new version of it for my Earth Day animation, which you may have seen.
Certainly.
And I've just completed a video. It's almost 20 minutes long of a continual sort of sphere of clusters that are evolving and changing and shape-shifting. And I put some music on it, which actually is music by Jonas Sharp, who composed some music for Darwin Pond, which was my artificial life simulation that I made at Rocket Science Games in the 90s.
Certainly.
And so I'll be putting that up. But I also want to, I do have a version of it on a browser, so you can watch it forever, like a forever lava lamp. And
certainly.
It's on my webpage. If you go to the Earth Day link, you can see it.
Definitely.
And that's the latest clusters. And I do plan to write a paper about that and make a video one of these days.
So in terms of, spheres are wonderful for cellular automata and a variety of other algorithms. What are your clusters based on?
What are they based on? Well, in fact, they're very similar to springs and point masses because You take two particles, and if they are near each other, and near is just defined by some radius, they can experience either attractions or repulsions from each other. And I was describing this to my friend Frank Delaglio, who is a biomolecular expert, and he was saying, "Oh, well, that's just like what happens with atoms. There are interatomic forces." And there's a thing, I think it's called the Vanderham or something. It's an equation, and it's really quite simple. And I might be changing the clusters or maybe adding another variation on how these forces work to make it more like actual atoms and molecules. And perhaps that would bring out some more effects. But what's astonishing is that just these simple forces, which is just a handful of numbers, create such amazing variety. And I think it's a great example of emergence. What kinds of larger structures can grow, both space and time structures, out of these simple rules.
And the properties of spheres are fascinating in terms of just running simulations on the surrounds of spheres. I'm assuming you're getting the most out of that as well.
Yes. Well, there are two aspects of spheres. The actual particles have spherical force fields around them. And also they are running on a sphere. And, putting a two-dimensional thing on a sphere is a classic problem that's been looked at in many different ways. And so one of the ways that I do this is I just make it a 3D simulation and just force them onto the surface of a sphere. So there are no particular polyhedral rule or there's no gimbal lock. There are no features that the sphere imparts on these things. So it's very natural in that sense.
Yeah, it provides interesting mathematics and interesting continuities, I've found, when I've simulated stuff on spheres.
Right, and the sphere, of course, is the sort of ongoing theme of all of my Earth Day animations. Every year when I make an Earth Day animation, I'm like, okay, what can I learn about a sphere? What's another interesting spherical geometry problem that I can explore, and at the same time making a tribute to our planet. So that's my little tradition every year.
In terms of the current discussion associated with generative AI, as an artist and a theoretician and a variety of different things that map very well onto this kind of stuff, what's your current thinking on generative AI?
Well, I'm just as interested and excited and slightly terrified as everybody else about it. I think, I haven't really played with it very much, although I did touch upon it for a project that I was doing. Here's one really interesting thing about it. I have a collaborator, Luke Nagoita, who I worked with on a gene pool project. And he has developed a way for a user to have a conversation with one of the swim bots in gene pool.
Interesting.
And yes, and what he's doing is he set it up so that it runs on a browser. And I'll send you a link to that, and maybe you can put it up there. It's still a work in progress. But what's fascinating about it is, as far as I think, is that one could play with Gene Pool and click on a swim bot and start talking with it and asking about what it's doing. And these swim bots could be trained on evolutionary biology. So not only are they playing out their lives in the simulation and evolving, they can also be talking to us about what they're doing. So that's one of the possible applications of this interesting work that Luca is doing.
The idea of narrative coming from A-Life is something that I've certainly weaved into my own work, and it produces a lot of interesting outputs and actually the thing that interests me about using ChatGPT, and I've asked it to write poetry and talk to it about moral philosophy and done a bunch of, tests associated with how effective is this in corresponding with me and what other, hard edges do I see associated with corporate governance and various other things.
Yeah.
But the nature of play and the nature of A-Life simulation has always caught me that we don't exploit it enough associated with creating these kind of environments. And the idea of having a conversation with the swim bot fascinates me. What kind of things is the swim bot coming back with the human, and how does the human feel following this? Have you played with a swim bot at all through this interface?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because just like a half an hour ago was the first time I ever played with it, because Luca just finished making it. We did have a conversation about it, and it's very interesting because it's all about how it's trained, and or what kind of information it's using. It looks like Luca has set it up so that these swim bots are they're not tapping into all of the ugly stuff on the internet. So you can have a conversation, a nice, safe conversation. But the fact is I'm still new at this, and I need to talk to Luca. I was hoping that maybe someday we can have a conversation with both
Certainly.
me and Luca if you're interested.
Yes, most definitely.
He has a PhD in ecology, and when I met him, he was in the Galapagos. Not that I met him in the Galapagos, but he was working for the Charles Darwin Foundation, and we did a project together, which was really, really exciting because he added a whole level of ecology expertise to Gene Pool. But yeah, it would be great. We're hoping that this would be a fun little app. And maybe once we get that going, we can have another conversation about it.
I think the thing that captivates me more than anything is, given limitless amounts of memory and limitless amounts of processing and perhaps limitless amounts of network, you can do completely different style simulations. Have you thought about this in terms of the contemporary level of computing or anything like that? Or you seem to be enjoying what you're doing currently, but do you feel that this moves you in any given direction?
Are you referring to, say, the vast amounts of data on the internet that we can tap, or
well, potentially so,
power?
But more compute power, more abilities to save vast amounts of squirrel it away in one way or another. I mean, I think certainly when you think about what we were doing a decade ago or even 2 decades ago, we were still very much limited on this concept of computation as it existed in a single machine in front of us and playing with that kind of computation. Right. I think that has changed. And it's actually created a quality which seems to be more, capable of doing wonderful things, hopefully. Obviously, clearly capable of doing bad things as well. But I'm just thinking, in terms of your unique perspective and your particular kind of artist, your theoretician, the full gamut, is it something that's tickled your mind currently, or have you not really begun to explore it?
Well, yeah, it's constantly tickling my mind. And I think there are 2 aspects of it. I just got this Mac M1, which is a super fast, wonderful performing machine. And because of it, I'm able to run these videos at high resolution. And, my Earth Day animation is real time. And also doing these spring and point mass simulations with flexible tetrahedra and so on. They run really fast. And so, in a sense that when I was starting to work on there.com, the virtual world with Will Harvey, we were daydreaming about using springs and balls to compute not just dune buggies and avatars, but everything, the entire world.
Yes. And
we were like, okay, well, compute power, we're not there yet, but maybe someday we will be. And, we continue to inch our way forward so that we can reach down lower to the laws of nature to create emergence that goes higher. So we have a larger bandwidth of emergence to play with, I think. But this is the computer that's sitting in front of me in local space. Then there's the vast amount of data that's out on the internet, which does not afford the animation rates simply because of latency, which is getting better. But I think that there are 2 realms. There's the vast amount of data out there, and the AI that's tapping into it. And then there's the performance, which is really what touches the eyes and ears in real time. So, I think there are ways to tap the what both have to offer, which is something that we were doing at Dare.com. We were exploring how can the motions and activities in this avatar or in these things in the world, how do they fit in with what's going on the servers, which at the time in the 90s was slower. Anyway, fascinating stuff. And yes, so I'm really, really thrilled to have this faster compute power to explore things on a lower level.
It is interesting. I spent some time, was an early proponent of Apple's Metal technology. I'm not sure if you played with Metal at all, but fought it, and 7 years, I filed a bunch of issues with it, took a couple of years off, came back into it. And then I've realized with the M1, why was I even doing low-level graphics programming?
Yeah.
Because the M1 just gives it to you, it hands it to you straight, and all the bugs and flaws and issues that I found through it, I was just like, let's discard all of that, go back a decade worth of graphics and, use what's there and allow the M1 just to show it. So it is an interesting kind of juxtaposition of now having the power that, all the previous study and previous nonsense that one had to wade through in order to get things working just doesn't have to be there anymore.
Yes, I was actually wondering, I was talking with my colleague Brian Dodd last night about how fast the HTML canvas has become. And I was wondering, is it that it's connected to the GPU? I would assume that there are ways that it's using the GPU to run faster.
Yes.
But it is amazingly fast these days.
So you mentioned tantalizingly, maybe accidentally, when we first talked, associated with the VR company that you were thinking of putting together. Is that worth pitching or discussing, or should you just be to be continued?
No, this would not be my own entrepreneurial pursuits. Wiggle Planet was my last, probably and only effort to do that. This is actually a project with Frank Delaglio, who I mentioned before. He is at NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. I think that's what it stands for. And what he does is he studies things that are very small and kind of invisible, such as how proteins are arranged and how how molecules interact. And so by exploring and designing proteins, the VR project that I'm working on is going to have three aspects. One is to take the spectrum of a nuclear magnetic resonance experiments and to visualize them in a way that's very intuitive and embodied. So you can walk through or fly through as if you were looking through a drone.
Wonderful.
This landscape and the mountains and valleys would correspond to actual data that these researchers care about. And you'll be able to do this, and using the HTC Vive Pro, it would be pretty high res immersive experience. But then on a perhaps a little bit more practical level, we'll be loading up molecular modeling software so that you'll be able to stand in the middle of a protein molecule and reach out to atoms and just sort of experience from inside. And there are things to be learned from that.
Certainly.
In terms of the kinds of structures that hanging off the central spine of a protein and seeing them and not just standing there and looking at it in VR, but changing parameters in real time.
Yes.
So that would create a very intuitive level of what the researchers are doing.
The ability to visualize that is something that is incredibly powerful. I remember when I was studying theoretical physics, there were physicists that could just take mathematical equations and manipulate them in such a way that they clearly had a kind of multi-dimensional visualization going on in their head associated with the mathematics. And not having that ability, I always thought, if only this was in software. And I think you touched on exactly that.
What was the last thing you said?
You've touched on exactly that. There are obviously people that have the benefit of doing this kind of visualization already in their head. But by presenting the visualization, it means anyone can enjoy the spaces, basically.
Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting about data visualization, especially data visualization that's multisensory and haptic and immersive, is that sometimes an expert who is adept and experienced at visualizing in their mind's eye, they might not want it perhaps at first because they've become so good at using their inner eye.
Certainly.
So it's tricky to part of my challenge, I believe, for this work is to understand what these researchers want to know and care about. They don't want to jump into a computer game. Mm-hmm. They want to do their research. So what are the sensory modalities that I can offer to them that will help them become intuitive and not become distracted by it. So it's an interesting challenge, I think, in data visualization.
Certainly. So I'm not sure if you have a sense of the audience of this podcast. As the creator of the podcast, I certainly don't have a sense of the audience of the podcast. But in terms of just general thoughts, things that you'd like to throw out to the Biota community, I don't know whether it's changed. It was a bunch of undergraduate students at one stage. What's your sense of the community, and what kind of ideas would you like to send to them?
Yeah, I guess I'm not as I follow a few people on Twitter and I have conversations there and with what's left of Twitter, that is. A-Life. If I go to this A-Life conference, which is actually in Hokkaido, kind of a long trip, but perhaps I can experience some of it online. I'll definitely learn a lot about what people are doing in A-Life. Let's see. What did I see recently? I've seen a number of planetary simulations, and I think that, you've developed with Noble Ape, an ecosystem that's been going for a while. I don't know if Polyworld is still running.
No, unfortunately, that's something I've been meaning to point out, but Polyworld unfortunately doesn't run anymore. And I tried to download it and tried to find maintainers, and it hasn't been touched for a number of years. But yes, Larry Yeager, I think, had some graduate students that were maintaining it after he left for Google, and unfortunately it doesn't work currently. So yes, that seems to be something that's missing. But look, I go back and look at things like Breve, which no longer is supported, this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, the number of these things do not have the the craziness that I've had to deal with. It's now called the Ape SDK because Noble Ape was another thing. So, yes, I still maintain it to this day, and it's still, I think of myself more as a hobbyist more than anything now, because just the nature of maintaining software for this length of time is like that.
It's hard to maintain it, and it's funny. We think that because it's digital, it shouldn't atrophy, but it kind of does atrophy because it lives in a in our technological world, and things change around it, and so it dies on the vine unless you're taking care of it. Most definitely. I think I'm interested in, and I've heard some people talk about ChatGPT and the ChatGPT. I keep getting that mixed up, and that people say that there cannot be intelligence or consciousness in these large language models because they are not embodied. They're abstract. And if there were some embodiment, and then some people say, well, perhaps the internet is their body, is the embodiment that they can use. And then there are some people who say, well, if it was given a simulation, like if they could be trained on some sort of a simulation of physics, then perhaps that would add to their intelligence. But perhaps in that sense, there could be a new form of A-Life that is essentially running on a large language model. But perhaps language would not be the correct thing to call it. Perhaps it would be something semiotic on a level that that relates to biological entities interacting with each other.
One of the first tests I gave ChatGPT, I think maybe 3, I've also played with ChatGPT 4, was to write an A-Life simulation. And it's quite interesting because the language you pick for it to write it in will give the either positive or... Thankfully, you can argue with it. So once it creates an A-Life simulation that doesn't quite compile, you can tell which bits aren't compiling, and then he'll rewrite it for you. So you can get into quite interesting. And I was quite almost taken aback initially how, it was, very much associated with foxes and rabbits and food sources and these kind of things. Yeah. But it did it did write an A-Life simulation that I think would have at least kept an undergraduate student relatively interested for at least, half an hour. So the thing that interests me about it is more the creative arts. I've asked it to write poetry in particular styles of both fictional characters and historical characters, and a variety of different tests. And the moral philosophy stuff I found genuinely interesting. I was talking with, I think, ChatGPT-4 about Operation Paperclip and, what the moral quandary was of sending over these Nazi scientists and have them developing so much part of the, contemporary technology space, and what, the moral objection to that might be, and all this kind of quality, which it did particularly well. I actually left that conversation feeling like I'd had a decent conversation with, a friend in some regard, which was a very strange experience, having just typed into this web browser for a few minutes. But I guess I have generally low expectations with these things and just look to promote what aspect of, Wikipedia intelligence it actually exists at. But no, I've remained interested, let's just say, with the potentials of this kind of stuff. I think it deems people such as yourself to play with it more.
Yeah, I think you have the right approach. I mean, use it as a creative tool and explore it, as a companion for your creative efforts. The moral is that's getting up on the edge of whether I think it's interesting to explore. I forgot what I was going to say about this, but I think that here's one thing. The uncanny valley is a human response, right? Mm-hmm. And the uncanny valley is evolving with us as long as our technologies and our simulations become more realistic and more varied. And I think our theory of mind has to evolve as well to accommodate these pseudo entities that we're interacting with. And I really don't know how that will happen, but it has to. We have to become more discerning about what's a real person and what isn't. Some people are saying that we're sort of approaching the end of the Turing test question, where that's not even the question anymore. It's something else, right? So we're really entering a new realm where our theory of mind that we've evolved to interact with each other and understand what others are thinking, and to know that you're not a zombie. Those things are really being pushed to the edge and challenged, I think, right now.
Certainly. I mean, it's interesting talking to people after having these experiences, because I now think of the kind of intelligence that I'm being presented with more like a library. What's particularly interesting is where it gets basic elements wrong and then kind of tries to lie or fudge its way out of the experience. There are some interesting boundaries. I think I haven't tried it with you, but I tried it with me, and I tried it with Bruce Damer asking to give a biography for us. And it gave very interesting biographies that were completely wrong, but very interesting biographies where clearly they had elements of reality, elements of information, misinformation, stuff that had been written down wrong on some web page a decade ago that it just ran with. And it was actually quite fascinating. I've owned a variety of companies in England and a variety of things through these evolutions, and actually it was quite funny, but clearly very wrong. And I think what interests me is this technology is used more for... So, for example, in the writing of software, initially ChatGPT, I think 3, will only give you a certain length of software. So control software that would be used in a nuclear facility, these kind of things, it's not capable of doing. You can ask it to refine down, and I'm also playing with Bard, which is the Google version, but that's supposed to. I haven't found the languages yet. I've heard TypeScript is a good language for it to program in. But again, refining it and seeing, what the deep depth of programming these things can actually do, because obviously this is something that, we both have an interest in. But, the moral philosophy stuff and things like that, I mean, the replacing of politicians and lawyers and accountants with this kind of software, I think is very interesting, particularly as it justifies its own reality, so to speak, once it, says these half-truths. You can actually say, what you've said is wrong, please go and get, redo that, that's wrong, and then it gives you an alteration. But it is an interesting it is an interesting experience, particularly when you ask it to, give a biography of, someone like Bruce Damer, for example, where it kind of obviously has its feelers in various parts of the internet. It puts together a relatively coherent part, but there are certain bits which are just generally wrong. And I think it's fascinating. It's a fascinating problem space because, as you say, the theories of the mind that we have to date are all distinctly 19th century in this regard. And that needs to be redone in some way. And my hope is that perhaps the listeners to this podcast, well, I know for a fact, ChatGPT is written by OpenAI. OpenAI has Jeff Clune and Ken Stanley. In fact, you referenced Ken Stanley in your Walker paper as well. So, these are two people I've spoken to previously who are part of OpenAI. So I think we've, in some regard, created elements of this thing. Not explicitly us, but our broader kind of community has had a heavy influence on OpenAI and probably Google Bard as well. Mentioning, Larry Yeager. I don't know where Larry Yeager ended up in Google, but obviously he has a good background with regards to neural networks and these kind of things. So my view is that the ALAF community kind of spawned an aspect of this. And that gives an interesting means of us to do analysis on the particular software and obviously see our former peers, maybe our current peers, are actually still producing this stuff.
Yeah, well, I hadn't really thought much about the ALF community and ALF simulations and how that overlaps or correlates with these new language models. And it really brings up a lot of questions for me. So, right. I mean, they're based on, it's based on language. It gobbles up, including verbal language, audio language, and visual language, right? All the output of humanity that's on the internet that it can gobble up and mix them and match them, right? In ways that we can't even know how it's doing those things. And so it makes me wonder, how, if it's just about language, if it's just about human language, then I'm not sure how much it can tap into artificial life simulation material, but perhaps it can and will go deeper than that, right? To something that may be proto-language, which I believe would be part of how biology works. It's sort of a proto-language, a biosemiosis of signs and signals exchanged between organisms. But one of the other things about these large language models is, you were saying that it'll write a biography and get it wrong. What it's doing is it's talking as if it's telling the truth. And so it's right,
filling in the gaps.
It'll state something as fact, even if it's not a fact. And in fact, a friend of mine did a search on my name, and at the very end it said yes. And Jeffrey Ventrella also plays saxophone. I'm like, what? I've never played saxophone. Turns out there's another person of the same name who plays sax.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's just collecting stuff. Maybe there will be a way to for us to all train. I can say no, that's wrong. It's like this, and it'll be corrected. And perhaps that will be the way to fix this problem.
Hopefully so.
Yeah.
It's going to be a very interesting world in the future. Jeffrey Ventrella, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. I hope I've perturbed you in some way, and maybe we can chat again in a few years' time. But look, as things continue to evolve, it's wonderful to have the opportunity just to ask you for a chat periodically. So thank you very much for the opportunity to chat today.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a joy. Thank you.
Thank you.